Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Welcome to the course Environmental Impact Assessments. Today we are going to look into methods involved in assessing climate change under the larger ambit of methods in EIA. Assessments for climate change in EIA is not very well established, or it's not very clear in many countries, including ours. We, however, cover many aspects of it under the ambit of air quality evaluation. Nevertheless, it will be useful for us to learn the developments in the other parts of the world. We will follow chapter 5 of the textbook which we are referring for this particular course, Ricky Thirlwell and Graham Wood for this particular session. Accordingly, the coverage will have a basic understanding, then we'll look into definitions and concepts, and then we'll look into key legislation, guidance and standards. So accordingly, after completion of this session, you should be able to review its purpose, why we need to do it. You need to explain different definitions and concepts involved in this particular theme. You should be able to list key legislations, guidance and standards in this domain. You may recollect that in the initial lectures, we had looked into the drivers of climate change through the readings of Global Environmental Outlook 6. We learned that climate change has become an independent driver by itself and it's causing environmental change and poses a serious challenge to future economic development. Climate change poses risks to human society, for us, and through impacts on food and water security, which is well established fact, however require more work to understand it. Nevertheless, it is well established that climate change increases the existing risk and creates new risks for natural and human systems. We had seen that our activities, human activities, have caused climate change and impacted on ecosystems, have transformed the Earth's natural system. It has we have exceeded the capacity and we have been disrupting the self-regulatory mechanism of the ecosystem, and these are irreversible, and we have irreversible consequences because of us. We also saw that our environment is so seriously affected by ongoing changes such as climate change and land use change, especially because of deforestation, that these have reached the point that the ecological foundation of our society and natural system that support life is in great danger. So we are at the point now where we encounter the danger. Before us is a big challenge to survive with this range of human-induced damages, including climate change, deforestation, desertification, loss of biodiversity. We also see the scarcity of natural resources, pollution, and the consequent natural and the associated environmental impacts. Therefore, climate change is the most serious environmental challenge we are facing now, and it is said to be not only physical but also a political, social and economic challenge. And this problem requires action at various levels at global, national and local as well as individual scale. You can see the snip from IPCC Assessment Report 6, 2021, where they show the rate of climate warming in the last 2000 years. In the left-hand side, you can see the change in the global surface temperature, which is the decadal average we can see here, and in the right-hand side, average change in global surface temperature. You may notice how the line is shooting up in the recent past, and we have also provided the link for this report to you for further reading if you wish. As per the report, limiting climate change will require, whatever change we are undergoing, limiting that will require substantial and sustained reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. For this, the first legally binding agreement was Paris Agreement in December 2015, where 195 countries committed to holding the increase in global temperature to well below 2 degrees centigrade above the pre-industrial levels, and to pursue efforts to limit the increase to 1.5 degree Celsius above pre-industrial levels. Considering that this would significantly reduce the risk and impacts of the climate change, and we will also allow adaptability, it will allow climate resilience, it will allow us to foster climate resilience and ensure food security for all. So countries have agreed to meet every 5 years to review the targets, like you recently witnessed COP26. I've provided the link to these reports as well if you want to review. In this context, we see that EIA is an important tool. So since we are studying EIA, it's an important tool. The EIA process can assist in making it possible to review newer projects in line of climate change mitigation. We also see that in past decades, numerous regulatory and funding agencies such as the World Bank, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, OECD, and the European Union have issued regulations or guidelines requiring or promoting the consideration of climate change in EIA procedures. So all of these emphasize on the usage of this. Also, the International Association for Impact Assessment, IAIA, have published best practice principles. So many of CO2 emissions concerns are addressed through air quality assessment. So we see that if it is not specifically described, many of the concerns are addressed through air quality assessment. Mostly in EIA assessment, evaluation we see is limited to evaluating emissions, and check is kept at the ambient air quality. So that is what we have been mostly doing. However, there is still limited initiative to check the effects on the global climate. So we are not really checking in this process how the impact is on the global climate, or we do not undertake cumulative effects or look at the adaptation to climate change within the EIA framework. So we are currently only looking at the emissions and not at the cumulative scale or the global scale, and we are not even looking at the adaptation part of it. So the reason being, what has been explained is that it's very complex to establish causal relationship because of multiple factors playing roles. So it's not a very simple thing, but there are multiple factors which play. There's a lot of interaction which takes place. So it's a complex thing to estimate concerning this. So that is another reason why it's not being done in many places. We see that as per the climate change policy, the climate change requires to be addressed at 2 stages. So we see that first, we need to address through climate change mitigation. So another term is climate change mitigation, which conceptually looks into reducing the carbon emission. So when we talk about climate change mitigation, we are specifically talking about reducing carbon emissions. Second, through climate change adaptation. So when we talk about adaptation, we conceptually look into resilient developments where we can handle the unavoidable climate change. So whatever comes, we are able to face that. So we talk about these 2 things. Further, we also look at the interaction between the two. So we look at the interaction between the mitigation as well as between the adaptations. So these are the major concerns when we look into climate change. Currently, there are challenges in assessments concerning climate change because of following reasons. You see that it's very difficult to undertake cumulative impact. It's very difficult to determine the risk, and there's also involved uncertainty, as well as we see that Fixing the time zone is also a challenge, so like the lifespan of a project or beyond that. So the timeline is large, so fixing that is also a challenge here. And then also identifying the interaction, because there are a lot of factors which come into play, so identifying the interaction is also a complex part here. Now let us look at the few definitions and concepts before we get into climate change assessment part. We may note that in climate change reference, mitigation is slightly different, and we are going to follow IPCC report definitions here. So adaptation means the process of adjustment to actual or expected climate or its effects. So when we look at this, how do we really adjust to the changes which will happen? So in our system, through adaptation, we moderate or we avoid damage or harm, or we tend to exploit the benefits of the opportunity which comes with the change. So that all is termed as adaptation. In natural system, the process of adjustment to actual climate and its effects happen, and it is also possible that through our interventions we may facilitate adjustment to expected climate and its effects. So by our intervention also our adaptation can take place. Let us now look at what adaptive capacity means. Adaptive capacity means the ability of our systems. Systems could be the institutions, our human systems, and the other organism which adjust to the potential damage, or even they can take advantage of the opportunity. So we look at our adaptive capacity. So through these medium, through the institutions, our systems, how we can really handle this damage or take advantage of this damage. So that's termed as the adaptive capacity. Or even not only handle the damage or the opportunities, but to also respond to the consequences or the results of the damage. So whatever happens, how do we really respond to that? You can think of various situations where you or your family has adapted to the changes which happened, like could be positive or negative, whatever changes happen. So how you or your family adjusted to that particular situation. And think of the capacity, like capacity in terms of the financial capacity, social capacity, which allowed you to adapt to the situation. Now looking at the term climate, so climate as given by IPCC, in a very simplistic way we call it average weather. In statistical term, we look at the mean, the average and the variability of the relevant quantities over a period of time. And this period of time can range from months to thousands of millions of years. So we look at those statistical descriptions here. The classical period, when we look at these durations, so the classical period which we consider is generally ranges from 30 years as it is given by World Meteorological Organization, WMO, and it can be beyond that as well. And then the relative quantities which we look at mostly when we refer to this is temperature, precipitation and wind. Those are the things which we look at. And in a broader sense, climate can be defined as the state of climate system. So what is the state, including the statistical description. So this is about the climates. Now looking at climate change. Climate change is a change in the state of the climate. So we saw what climate means, and then how that climate, the state of that climate changes, and that can be identified by the medium of statistical tests. So we describe it statistically, and we would see how those variations are happening, such as the variation could be in terms of mean or the variability of its properties, those properties which we discussed about, and that change, so whatever change happens, that lasts for a longer period, such as for the decades or even longer than decades. So when such kind of variations happen, then we call it climate change. Climate change can happen both naturally or by activities, our activities. So we see those changes can happen. And now looking at climate projection. So the climate projection is the simulated results of the climate system to the various scenarios. So we see what kind of scenarios will happen and how our climate would be. So that's about the climate projection, and climate projections are different from prediction. So mostly how it is different, that the projection relies on various assumptions. So we are making certain assumption related to with emissions or even the political system or the social context. So we make assumptions which we look at various scenario which is created. So that is where we look at climate projection. Now looking at greenhouse gases. This is one of the key elements of climate change. Greenhouse gases are gases constituents of the atmosphere, which are both natural and anthropogenic. Anthropogenic means produced by human activities, our activities, that absorb and emit radiation at specific wavelength within the spectrum of infrared radiation emitted by the Earth's surface, atmosphere, and clouds. This property causes the greenhouse effect. So we see various, like even the water vapor, major concern is on carbon dioxide, nitrous oxide, methane, ozone are the primary greenhouse gases in the Earth's atmosphere. So moving forward, now we'll look at impact. What do we really understand when we talk about impacts with respect to climate change? Impact term is used for results, effects of realization of the risk on natural and human systems. So whatever risk we are predicting, if we realize that, what kind of results would happen. So that's the impact. The risk results from the climate related hazard. That include, like the climate related hazard would include extreme weather and climate events, exposure and vulnerability. Impacts usually refer to effects on lives. So if impact happens, it would be not just the physical impact, but or the casualties, it would be on livelihood, health, well-being, ecosystems, economies, societies, culture, and even it may hamper the ecosystem services and also the infrastructure. So we see what impact could be. So the results of the risk, and risk we have seen is coming from the interaction between hazard, exposure, and vulnerability. Now looking at mitigation in the context of climate change. Mitigation is a human intervention. So how do we reduce it? What we and you can do to reduce the source of problem. So how we can cut it down or enhance the absorption capacity, how we can take away the greenhouse gases from the environment. So that is what is concerned when we talk about mitigation in the context of climate change. So now looking at the term resilience. So resilience, what do we really mean by the term? Resilience is the capacity of social, economic, and environmental systems to cope with a hazardous event or trend or disturbances. So how do we really cope with that? And how do we respond or reorganize in ways that maintain the essential functions? So how we are able to get back to our minimum functions. So whatever essential functions are there, we are able to maintain those functions. And then identity and structure, while also maintaining the capacity for adaptation, learning, and transformation. So we maintain the minimum qualities which are required in the given situation. So that is what is termed as resilience. So now looking at the term sink. Sink here in this context is carbon sink, and it is referred to the processes or the activities or mechanism that removes greenhouse gases, an aerosol or a precursor of greenhouse gases or aerosol from the atmosphere. So whichever removes, the process or the mechanism or whatever activity removes it from the environment, removes the greenhouse gases from the environment, is termed as sink. So now we'll look at another term, vulnerability. So vulnerability is a tendency. It's like individuals or communities' tendency to suffer from a particular condition. So whatever conditions you are exposed to, how sensitive you would be to that, how much you would suffer from that particular condition. Vulnerability is an umbrella term that holds concepts and elements of sensitivity. So it takes care of sensitivity. It also takes care of the susceptibility to harm. So how much susceptible you are, how much sensitive to any particular damage you are. So vulnerability takes care of all those dimensions here, as well as it also takes care of the dimension of capacity. So your capacity, lack of capacity to cope or adapt is also covered under this vulnerability. So whenever we talk about vulnerability, it would be talking about the sensitivity, susceptibility, as well as your capacity to cope and adapt. Okay, so that was about concepts and definitions which we saw. Now we'll move on to our next segment in this particular session, where we'll look at the key legislation, guidance and standards which are in place for to review the climate change. Literature indicates that number of agencies and regulatory authorities have recently set requirements for climate change to be considered in the assessment process, environmental assessment process, and the process understanding is still evolving. So we do not really have a complete understanding, and it's not really implemented everywhere. As per the book which we are referring, Tharwal and Wood's book, we see that there are only few countries such as Australia, Canada and Netherlands who have implemented such regulations. So you can see how limited is right now implementation of this. This domain is still evolving. Even we see in USA. In USA, the Council of Environmental Quality have confirmed. So there is an assertion to that climate change falls within the scope of EIA, and it should be addressed. So according to National Environmental Policy Act, NEPA, so it is acknowledged that. And we see that some of the states such as California and state of Massachusetts have incorporated climate change in their environmental assessment law within the state. In the snip here, you can see that the California Environmental Quality Act and Climate Change Guidelines. So you can see the guideline here. It provides requirements to quantify existing and projected community-wide greenhouse gas emissions. It provides input on establishing greenhouse gas emissions reduction targets over the life of the plan, so your project plan. So you need to establish those greenhouse gas emissions, how much you're going to reduce, identify and analyze the greenhouse gas emissions resulting from sources in the community. So you need to identify from where the greenhouse gases emissions are happening. Further, you also need to identify a set of specific and forcing measurable measures that collectively will achieve the emission targets. So what are your strategies, what measures you're adopting so that you can attain the target. So that all needs to be specified in your assessment report. Further, you need to you need to establish mechanism to monitor plans, how you're going to monitor that, and how you would adopt in the public process, how this entire thing will be adopted. So all these have to be taken care. So here you can see the snip of the law from the California state. So countries have started incorporating it. how the assessment is undertaken, the quality of assessment are very different across cases. So within the countries also you'll see there's variation. And among countries also you'll see variations. So for example, some assessment reports provide detailed record of greenhouse gases emissions. They give a detailed quantification and sources of emissions. So there's a detailed inventory which comes in, whereas some of the assessment report provide a cumulative estimate of the total emissions. So they do not give the detail, but they give you the cumulative estimate, whereas you can see in many of the reports that they do not even provide other details. It might only state that greenhouse gas emissions may occur because of the project and may leave out the other details. So there are variations how these things are handled in practice. Further, we see in Canada, it is seen that the process of assessment requires to consider changes caused by the environment as per the Canadian Environmental Assessment Act, CEAA. This is Act which is a legal basis for federal environmental assessment process, and this particular Act sets out responsibility and procedure for carrying out the environmental assessment of projects which involve federal government decision making. So we see that the Act does not clearly states the climate change, but has it in its process. So it has embedded the climate change in its process. A link to the Act is provided to you if you are interested in reading it further in more detail. Likewise, you see in Australia, Australian Capital Territory requires that all environmental impact assessment report to consider climate change. It requires the assessment report to consider both mitigation and adaptation part. So we did talk about that more has been done on the mitigation. Adaptation is still very limited, but in Australia we see that they require both the aspect to be covered, mitigation as well as adaptation part. They have also developed a climate change vulnerability assessment framework. So you can also look at the vulnerability assessment framework which supplement the risk management standards for the planning, development, renewal, maintenance and management of public infrastructure. So this has been developed by them. You can see the snip of the report here, and the link to the framework is provided for your further reading. So Western Australia requires risk-based decision making in the coastal zone to include an allowance for sea level rise. So all these details are given. You can see the snip here. And also the link is provided for your further reference. In European Union, in the EIA directives, we find distinct guidelines for integrating climate change. So they have issued guidelines for integrated climate change and biodiversity into EIA, and then the link is provided to you. So you can see here how they have made suggestions for integration in the process. The new directive lays much importance on the climate change, mitigation, adaptation, as well as on resilience. It does it through the process of screening, scoping, and assessment aligned with the Paris Agreement. So you see that how stage-wise that particular review process is taken care of. We also see that the International Finance Corporation, IFC, of World Bank also provide guidelines through performance standards on environmental and social sustainability. In its performance standard, you can see it has a sequence of standards. Standard 1, where it provides assessment and management of the environmental and social risk and impacts. It provides guidelines on climate along with the other issues we see here. Likewise, you see the performance standard 3, which covers the topic of resource efficiency and pollution prevention. So that further provides input on greenhouse gases. So how that has to be tackled. Likewise, you see performance standard 4 also covers the concerns in its theme of like through community health, safety and security. So we see that IFC guidelines reinforces that one needs to identify the vulnerable communities and to also look into the interaction of physical and socio-economic impacts. So not only undertaking this process, but you need to be able to identify the vulnerable communities as well as to look at the interaction between all kind of impacts which are happening. Further, we see International Association for Impact Assessment, IAIA, also provides best practices guidelines on handling climate change in impact assessment. It provides key principles and how they might be operationalized through government, screening, education of practitioners, and by employment of local and indigenous knowledge. So how what principles can be adopted and how that can be can be implemented on ground. So you see here the principles. Further, we see Institute of Environmental Management and Assessment, IEMA, has also prepared detailed practice guidelines on integrating climate change adaptation into EIA, so how that can be integrated in the process. So you can see the snip of the report here, the link is provided to you. They also provide climate change mitigation principles, and also they are making a guideline on this. So you can see here. Further, we see that you have the Canadian Environmental Assessment Agency, CEAA, published a guidance for practitioners, which was modified in 2012, on how to incorporate climate change considerations into environmental assessment. You can see the snip of the table from the guidelines. You may notice how at different stages climate change considerations are suggested to be addressed in the EIA process. So you can see here how various scoping stage and so on, how various aspects have to be taken care. Likewise, you see they have issued guidelines for incorporating concerns of climate change in strategic assessment also, not only in EIA process, but also in the strategic assessment. So you can see here. Further, we see that in Scotland, the Scottish Natural Heritage, SNH, provides the guidance on EIA through the National Planning Framework, and the considerations are inbuilt, so it is not very separate, distinct, but it is inbuilt in its approach and emphasizes to certain areas. And we see that they have provided a guidance on EIA, which follows the National Planning Framework. We also find additional guidance for calculating potential carbon saving and losses arising from wind farm developments on peatlands in form of technical notes by Scottish government. So we see that, and this particular calculator is very helpful in establishing the environmental baseline for such projects. It is giving you the carbon calculator tool in form of the Excel spreadsheet, so you can calculate these things. So I've put the technical notes here for your reference. So summarizing today's session, so we'll cover that's all in this particular session. So summarizing, we looked at the purpose and the complexity around the impact assessments related with climate change within the EIA framework. Then we looked at various definitions and concepts, and then we looked at the key legislation, guidance and standards which are available for assessment purpose. So that's all for today. These were the references used. So these are certain suggested watch and read for you to identify more and more of the errors and similar studies here. Please feel free to ask questions. Let us know about any concerns you have. To share your opinions, experiences and suggestions. Looking forward to interacting and co-learning with you while exploring the subject of EIA. So that's all for today. Thank you.